I know. Just another video about something else that's supposedly killing us, right? That's exactly how I felt about microplastics for years, until recently, when I stopped tuning it out and actually looked at the research that's come out in just the past couple of years. And what I found was unfortunately way worse than I expected. So in this video, I want to show you what I read and how it changed my mind about what microplastics might actually be doing inside the human body. Number two, the ridiculous number of ways that we're exposed to microplastics, most of which you've probably never even thought about before. And third, and most importantly, what you can actually do about it. Because despite how depressing the topic sounds, there's actually some newer and surprisingly promising strategies that are emerging. So let's talk about microplastics. Because according to one published estimate, you may be consuming up to 5 grams of plastic every week. Not every year, every week. Roughly the weight of a credit card. And the point is this: microplastics are everywhere, and now they're inside all of us. Now, microplastics are these tiny fragments of plastic smaller than 5 millimeters, and nanoplastics are even smaller. So small, they can actually cross biologic barriers inside of us that are supposed to be there to protect us. And that exposure is constant. They're in the air that we breathe, the clothing that we wear. They're in the bottled water, the tap water, the seafood, the salt, honey, beer, fruits, vegetables, indoor air, household dust, carpets, synthetic clothing, food packaging, plastic cutting boards, basically modern life. Now, one study estimated that the average American may inhale or ingest somewhere between 74,000 and 121,000 particles of plastic per year. And people who drink exclusively from plastic water bottles may ingest an additional 90,000 particles annually compared to those who drink tap water. Now, when you hear that, it's just a bunch of numbers, right? So let's put it into context. In 2025, researchers at the University of New Mexico published a paper in the prestigious Nature Medicine, where they analyzed post-mortem human brain tissue, the brains of people who had died. And they found microplastics in every single brain they examined. Every one. But here's the part that should make everyone uncomfortable. The amount of plastic in the brains increased by roughly 50% between 2016 and 2024. Meaning this isn't static. We're accumulating plastic more over time. But then came the dementia findings. Those same researchers found the average brain of a decedent without dementia had about 4,000 micrograms of plastic per gram of brain tissue. But the average brain of a decedent with dementia had around 26,000 micrograms of plastic per gram of brain tissue. Every single dementia brain blew past this 10,000 microgram threshold that no normal brain even approached. And these weren't just floating around. The plastic particles were physically embedded in the walls of the blood vessels of the brain and lodged inside the immune cells of the brain. Now, let me be very clear here, because this doesn't prove that microplastics cause dementia, but it's a heck of an association. Because it is possible that maybe damaged brains simply accumulate more plastic, right? Maybe they have a more permeable blood-brain barrier. So if you really want to know the possible cause and effect, we need to look at animal studies, right? Because you can't just inject microplastics into humans and see what happens. Because animal studies are showing mechanisms that make this microplastic dementia association and cause and effect much more biologically plausible, because nanoplastics are shown to cross that blood-brain barrier and activate immune cells in the brain. In other words, these nanoplastics are triggering inflammation in the brain, what we call neuroinflammation. And they're even accelerating clumping of amyloid beta proteins, the hallmark of Alzheimer's disease. In one 2026 study on microplastics on mice, they found just 90 days of nanoplastic exposure worsened cognitive impairment and hippocampal damage, which is the area of the brain that's associated with decline in Alzheimer's. through specific inflammatory signaling pathways. And when they blocked those pathways, cognition improved. So the conversation is starting to shift. The question is no longer, can plastics get into the brain? That question has been answered. The question now is, what are they doing once they get there? And the brain isn't the only place that this is showing up. Researchers have identified these microplastics in the lungs, the liver, the kidneys, blood, placenta, breast milk, testes, ovarian fluid, even the first stool of newborn infants. Similar trends were found in the placentas. Scary enough, this study from Hawaii showed that microplastics were detected in 60% of the placentas sampled in 2006, 90% in 2013, and 100% of all the placentas they sampled in 2021, with the average particle count quadrupling over that period. And so the takeaway isn't just microplastics exist. The takeaway is human accumulation appears to be rapidly increasing. And when people hear this, the natural question becomes, okay, but are they actually harming us? And this is where we need to sort of separate into two different types of evidence. Like I said, the associative evidence and the mechanistic evidence. Now, associative evidence means these things are linked, right? Mechanistic evidence says we understand how this could cause damage. And one of the strongest associative studies so far was published in the New England Journal of Medicine just in 2024. So researchers looked at the carotid arteries of humans undergoing surgery for carotid artery disease. And they analyzed the plaque that they removed from the arteries. And they found microplastics embedded inside the plaque of 58% of the patients, mostly polyethylene, some PVC. But after these patients had surgery for the carotid artery disease, the researchers then followed these patients for 34 months. And they found that the patients with detectable microplastics in their arterial plaque had a 4.5-fold higher risk of heart attack, stroke, or death over those 34 months. 4.5 times, not 4.5%, 4.5-fold more death, heart attacks, or strokes. And again, this doesn't necessarily establish cause and effect, it's still an association. But when you combine that with the mechanistic research, things are really starting to become uncomfortable because microplastics appear to damage the body through several recurring pathways. The first is oxidative stress, because microplastics increase these reactive oxygen species, essentially creating molecular damage inside cells, damaging DNA. The second is through inflammation. Your immune system recognizes these nanoparticles and microparticles as foreign, right? So they can't break them down. So you get this persistent, low-grade inflammatory response. And chronic inflammation is really involved in pretty much every major chronic disease that we worry about. The third way that plastics are harming us is through barrier disruption. And this one's really important. Microplastics appear capable of damaging the intestinal barrier, often what people call leaky gut or leaky brain. And some of the visuals from animal studies are honestly pretty shocking. Researchers looked at the intestinal microvilli, these tiny sort of finger-like projections that absorb our nutrients in our gut lining. They looked at the healthy tissue and they looked dense and organized. But after microplastic exposure, those microvilli became flattened, disrupted, and damaged, meaning the very surface responsible for nutrient absorption may also become more permeable to toxins and inflammatory compounds. And then the other way that microplastics affect us is through endocrine disruption, because what that means is hormone disruption, right? Many plastics contain or attract hormone disrupting chemicals. And this is what some of the thyroid research is showing, and it becomes really, unfortunately, interesting but also scary. A 2026 study found the first direct evidence of microplastics inside human tissue. The patients with autoimmune thyroiditis, or what most people call Hashimoto's, or hypothyroidism, had roughly 10 times the concentrations than people without autoimmune hypothyroid. And another study that involved over 1,200 mother-child pairs, right, humans, found that higher placental microplastic levels were associated with lower thyroid hormone levels in the newborns. And the higher number of microplastics in the placenta, the lower the thyroid production of the newborn. So it was a dose-dependent response. So we have to wonder, what are we doing to our children, and even worse, our grandchildren, because there's growing evidence that the damage from microplastics, it doesn't just stop with you. It seems like it's probably passed down to not only your children, but your grandchildren. Now, obviously, no human studies have yet tracked microplastics' effect over multiple generations. That kind of research takes decades, but animal data is robust and deeply concerning. So in rats, when pregnant mothers were exposed to polystyrene microplastics in their water source during pregnancy and nursing, their male offspring, what we call the F1 generation, showed impaired testicular development, reduced sperm count, increased oxidative stress, damage to the DNA. Pretty nasty stuff. But if things couldn't get even worse, those effects persisted to the F2 generation, their grandchildren, even though those animals were never exposed to microplastics themselves. And the damage was inherited. So again, what's happened in the past few years is that research has moved past this theoretical harm of microplastics to mechanistic, causative evidence that microplastics can alter the health of various organisms that were never themselves actually exposed to the microplastics. So before this turns into a full existential crisis, let's talk about something practical, because what can you actually do about this? The strategy breaks down to basically 3 parts. Number 1, reduce the new exposure. Number 2, help your body clear what's in your gut. And number 3, mitigate damage from what's already inside you. So let's start with the biggest impact that you can do, reducing exposure. Because there's so many different ways that we're exposed, it's honestly absurd. So let's start with clothing. Polyester, nylon, spandex, right? Your leggings, your gym clothes, your athletic wear. This is all plastic, literal plastic. So a study published in Environmental Science and Technology found that simply wearing synthetic clothing releases comparable amounts of microplastics as it does when you wash it. Simply moving around, especially during exercise. And when those fabrics become UV damaged or worn down, the shedding increases dramatically. UV degraded polyester can literally release 20 to 40 times more microplastics than new fabric. Not 20 to 40%, 20 to 40 times more. And now some people might not worry about that, but here's the truth. Those nanoplastics get absorbed through the skin. A 2025 study applied radio-labeled nanoplastics to animal skin and tracked where those particles went. They didn't just stay on the surface. They migrated into the bloodstream of these animals. They went into the liver, they went into the lungs, the lymph nodes, other tissues. But that's through intact skin. Now think about when you're exercising. You're sweating. You're creating friction on the clothing. Tight, athletic clothing. Tight against your skin. And there's some areas of the body where this is likely to matter more, right? Regions like the groin, especially women's external genital area, where the tissue is more thin, it's more permeable, and more absorbent than typical skin. And that might actually represent one of the highest microplastic exposure sites on the body. So tight synthetic leggings worn during exercise, especially without a breathable natural fiber barrier like cotton underwear, may not be as harmless as we once assumed. So let's move on to water, plastic bottles, plastic tubing, plastic storage, plastic delivery systems. I don't think I need to spend much time talking about plastic water bottles, but it's not just plastic water bottles. See, this part annoys me because it's not just the water itself, it's what the water travels through. Modern plumbing often includes plastic piping, right? We've moved from copper piping to CPVC piping or PVC piping, meaning your exposure doesn't just stop at the source, it continues all the way to your tap. And as plastic pipes age, the polymer chains deteriorate, surfaces crack and peel, and they release increasing numbers of micro and nanoplastic particles. Now, critically, the smaller the pipe diameter, the worse the problem, which means your household plumbing is actually the most vulnerable point in the entire water system. So in the house, use a filter, a high quality filter, especially 1 micron or smaller. Those can remove microplastics from your drinking water. So microfiltration and ultrafiltration, or even reverse osmosis. But not to create more fear and angst in your life, but those standard activated carbon filters, like the ones that are in most basic water pitchers or in your fridge filter, they don't reliably remove nanoplastics. One study found using only granular activated carbon and ion exchange actually released more particles into the water. I mean, carbon filters are great for like chlorine taste and some chemical contaminants, but they just don't provide a physical barrier to these nanoplastics. So again, like microfiltration or ultrafiltration, or even better, reverse osmosis, would be a better option for reducing microplastic and nanoplastic exposure. So obviously, stop microwaving food in plastic containers because heat dramatically increases the particle release. So use glass or ceramic instead. And anything that has like a lower pH also causes more microplastics to be released. So when you buy like vinegar or ketchup, get it in a glass bottle. And this may seem obvious, but avoid degraded nonstick cookware and plastic cutting boards. Every time you cut something on plastic cutting boards, you're probably introducing a bit of that board into your food. Okay, so after you reduce exposure, the second thing you can do is try to clear these microplastics out of your body. And no, I don't mean what's already in your brain, your blood vessels, and your other organs. I mean clear the microplastics from what you have recently ate or drank. So this is an early and interesting area of research involving the gut microbiome. Researchers have screened hundreds of bacterial strains looking at microbes that could physically interact with microplastics. And some strains appear capable of binding these particles almost like a sponge. So here's a normal bacteria, and here's another bacteria that's sort of attracted and stuck to a lot of microplastics. And in animal studies, that increased fecal excretion of plastics while reducing the amount left behind in the intestines. Meaning your microbiome may not just be damaged by microplastics, it may actually help defend against them. And there's a company that's focused on a probiotic blend to help clear microplastics from the gut. That company is called Winnow, and you can find them at winnowlabs.com. And no, before you ask, I have absolutely no affiliation with them. But like I mentioned, there's also a hard truth here. We currently don't have a way to remove microplastics that have already accumulated inside our tissues, right? In our brain and our organs and whatnot. Your body doesn't really know how to break those down, and that creates that chronic inflammation. So the best strategy right now appears to be reducing exposure, right? You can also, as I said, possibly reduce microplastics in the gut. But the third way, right? The third way is to support your detoxification pathways and reduce downstream inflammation and oxidative stress, which brings us back to the boring advice nobody wants to hear. To reduce inflammation and oxidative stress, sleep, exercise, eat some fiber, eat polyphenols from fruits and vegetables, whole foods, stress reduction, because all those things help regulate inflammation. And since inflammation is one of the main ways that microplastics appear to be harming us, it makes sense. But here's the bottom line. I don't think microplastics are some magical, singular cause of our diseases. But I also don't think it's hype anymore. The evidence is moving from plastics exist in the environment to plastics are accumulating inside human tissue in a biologically meaningful way with possibly devastating consequences for us and future generations. And honestly, that is a really different conversation. So we don't need to panic, but we should probably stop pretending that this is irrelevant, because the exposure is real, the accumulation is real, and the health effects are becoming harder to dismiss every year. So make a few changes. right? Use better containers, filter your water, reduce unnecessary plastic exposure where you reasonably can. Not because you're trying to become perfect, but because this is one of those situations where small reductions repeated over many years may matter a lot. And if future research proves this is less dangerous than it currently appears, great. But if the current trajectory of evidence is correct, you'll probably be really glad that you started paying attention earlier. So if you found this helpful, hit like, subscribe, share this with someone who still thinks microplastics are just an environmental issue. And I'll see you in the next video.